This is Euronews Now. I'm Helena Humphrey, and here are your top stories. The war effort in Ukraine was front and centre of EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union address in Strasbourg. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky vows that normal life will return to recently liberated areas as soon as possible after a stunning counter-offensive. And the coffin carrying Queen Elizabeth II returns for a final night at Buckingham Palace before lying in state ahead of next week's funeral at Westminster Abbey in London.
Wearing blue and yellow, the war in Ukraine was front and centre of EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union address this morning in Strasbourg. Von der Leyen and guest of honour Olena Zelenska, the First Lady of Ukraine, were welcomed by EU Parliament President Roberta Metsola. Von der Leyen stressed European support for Kiev would continue.
This is not only a war unleashed by Russia against Ukraine. This is also a war on our energy. It's a war on our economy. It's a war on our values. It is a war on our future. It is about autocracy against democracy. And I stand here with the conviction that with the necessary courage and with the necessary solidarity, Putin will fail and Ukraine and Europe will prevail.
Zelensky was applauded by MEPs ahead of the address, as von der Leyen vowed that sanctions on Russia, which she said had left its economy in tatters, would continue as it was time for resolve. These are the remnants of Russia's occupation of northeast Ukraine. Tanks and other vehicles abandoned after its forces made a seemingly hasty retreat. Ukraine's military is now consolidating its gains made during its lightning-fast counter-offensive over recent days. It says it's reclaimed over 300 settlements in the Kharkiv region, raising the yellow and blue flag in places controlled by Moscow-backed forces for the past 6 months. In his nightly address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that stabilization measures were being carried out in over 4,000 square kilometers of liberated territory, and that normal life, such as the payment of pensions, would return as soon as possible. But some people in Ukraine's liberated towns say they're still bearing the scars of Russian rule. Police are investigating claims that civilians had been tortured and shot by Russian soldiers. Meanwhile, Moscow-backed forces are continuing to hit civilian infrastructure facilities throughout eastern and southern Ukraine. Russia says it's carrying out massive strikes on Ukraine's front line after it had to pull back troops in the Kharkiv region. The territorial shifts mark one of Russia's biggest setbacks since the start of the war, but the Kremlin appears no closer to a negotiated peace deal.
It's a sight that's grown familiar in the last week. Ukrainian flags being raised in formerly occupied territory, and the advance isn't over, at least according to the country's former president, Petro Poroshenko.
This is more than 3,000 square kilometers, and the impulse is not finished yet, despite of the fact that Putin tried to collect as soon as possible the reserve and bring them from Russian territory to the border of Donetsk and Kharkiv region.
And Poroshenko is confident that Europe will not stop its support for Ukraine, despite gas cuts from Russia.
Western people start to understand that this is not an assistance for Ukraine. This is an investment of every single European member state in their own security. Because if we do not stop Putin here in Ukraine, tomorrow Putin appeared in their own country.
For the former president, Europe cannot be safe as long as Russian President Vladimir Putin stays in power.
We definitely need to make Europe and the world safer, to deputinize Europe, to deputinize the world, and to deputinize Russia. The world will not be safe with Putin, and it may be safer without him.
Carcasses of tanks now litter the street in the wake of Kyiv's advances. Markers that some analysts say could be a turning point in the conflict.
The Queen's coffin arrived at Buckingham Palace on a rainy London evening, having left the sunshine of Scotland behind. It's said to have been her least favourite residence, but she won't be there for long. At precisely 14:22 UK time, a procession including the King and members of the royal family will set off for Westminster Hall to arrive there at 1500 hours. After a short service, the Queen will lie in state there for 4 full days. Earlier, the Princess Royal had accompanied the coffin from Edinburgh. Princess Anne has been by her mother's side since her death and on Tuesday released a heartfelt statement. "I was fortunate," she wrote, "to share the last 24 hours of my dearest mother's life. It's been an honour and a privilege to accompany her on her final journeys. Witnessing the love and respect shown by so many on these journeys has been both humbling and uplifting." King Charles and Camilla, the Queen Consort, who are now in London, earlier visited Northern Ireland as part of a tour of the UK as the new monarch. They met political leaders, attended a service at St Anne's Cathedral and greeted crowds.
I'm very proud that I'm here today, and hopefully we can see King Charles move the Northern Ireland question forward and achieve a situation where we can have peace in these islands for future generations.
I got to shake his hand and I was able to pass him on a scarf from the Northern Ireland Scout Association, and I was quite thankful to have it. Walked on to the next person. It's very friendly.
London is now bracing for hundreds of thousands of visitors over the next few days, culminating in Monday's state funeral.
Having been flown back from the Scottish capital, Edinburgh, last night by the Royal Air Force, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's coffin drove through London for a final night at Buckingham Palace, a place where she has spent so much of her working life. Later on today, though, she will leave it for the final time, and there will be a procession through the streets of London, down the Mall, through Horse Guards Parade, where of course she did the trooping of the colour every year, along Whitehall, past Downing Street, and to the Palace of Westminster, where the House of Commons and the House of Lords is. Part of that building is Westminster Hall. It dates back over 900 years to the time of the Norman invasion. It's the oldest part of the palace itself, and it has played host to many events through the years. It was originally this original site of the British justice system. There were courts in there, but it's also a banquet hall used by the likes of Henry VIII, and it's been used for the banquets of coronations and monarchs ever since, but also for their lying in states. Indeed, the Queen's own father, George VI, and her mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, lay in state in the hall, and many of the previous monarchs did as well. And so what will happen is the Queen will be placed in the centre of that hall on a platform. The coffin will have the royal standard put on top, as well as the orb and sceptre and crown as well. And then we will expect the queuing, which has already started, will start to move into the hall. Now, people are being told to prepare for a long queue, upwards perhaps of 15 hours on a course that stretches back through London, about 5 or 6 miles. They're being told to come dressed formally, to only bring a very small bag, and to be prepared for that long wait. Once they do get to the hall, then they will go through airport-style security, and they will be able to pay their final respects. They're being told they will not allowed to do any photography or filming, use mobile phones or any handheld devices, that it has to be at all times respectful. And that will go on until 6:30 a.m. on Monday, the actual day of the funeral itself. They're anticipating that as many as 750,000 people might have passed through the hall at that point. Now, then the body will be moved to Westminster Abbey, just over the road, for that funeral. We know that many world leaders will be attending, the likes of President Joe Biden, President Jair Bolsonaro, the Brazilian leader, President Recep Erdogan of Turkey. There will literally be dozens of world leaders, as well as, we believe, perhaps even the Emperor of Japan on a rare trip outside of his country. Then the body will be taken to Windsor Castle, where there will be a private family burial. Vincent McAviney, Euronews, London.
Stay with us, we've got plenty more coming up after a very short break.